The aircraft shuddered violently as it dropped below 50 feet. The gray Atlantic stretched endlessly in every direction, cold and indifferent. Waves rose and fell in slow, heavy swells. The air tasted of salt and engine oil. Inside the cockpit, the instruments rattled. The altimeter needle hovered just above zero. One miscalculation, one gust of wind, and the wingtip would catch the water. The pilot's hands were steady on the yoke. He was 18 years old. Ahead, cutting through the surface like a dark knife, the conning tower of a U-boat broke the horizon. It was turning, slowly. The crew hadn't seen him yet. They were scanning the sky at regulation altitude, 2,000 feet, maybe more. No one expected an aircraft this low. No one flew this low. It was against orders, against doctrine, against reason. The pilot pushed the throttle forward. The distance closed. 500 yards. 300. The U-boat's deck gun swung upward, too late. The crew scrambled. The pilot's thumb hovered over the release. He could see their faces now. He pressed. The depth charges tumbled free, spinning through the air just meters above the waves. The aircraft pulled up hard, engines screaming. Behind him, the sea erupted. The Atlantic Ocean was killing the Allies. By the winter of 1940, German U-boats had transformed the shipping lanes into a graveyard. Convoys that left Liverpool or Halifax arrived in tatters, if they arrived at all. Merchant vessels loaded with food, fuel, oil, and ammunition disappeared beneath the waves in silence. The men who sailed them knew the odds. Many never made it home. Britain was an island under siege. Every gallon of fuel, every ton of steel, every crate of medicine had to cross 3,000 miles of open water. And waiting beneath the surface, lurking in wolf packs, were the U-boats. They hunted in coordinated groups, guided by radio intelligence and commanded by men who understood patience. They struck at night, slipping between escort ships, firing torpedoes into the hulls of slow-moving freighters. By the time the convoy escorts reacted, the submarines had vanished into the black depths. The numbers were staggering. In 1940 alone, German U-boats sank over 4 million tons of Allied shipping. That was nearly 1,000 vessels, gone. The Royal Navy and the Royal Canadian Navy scrambled to provide escorts, but there weren't enough destroyers, not enough corvettes, not enough trained crews. The Atlantic was too vast. The submarines too many. Winston Churchill later admitted that the only thing that truly frightened him during the war was the U-boat peril. The Battle of the Atlantic was not fought with grand maneuvers or sweeping offensives. It was a war of attrition, a war of tonnage. If the Germans could sink ships faster than the Allies could build them, Britain would starve. The war would be over without a single German soldier setting foot on English soil. Coastal Command was supposed to stop them. The Royal Air Force's Coastal Command had been established to patrol the seas, protect convoys, and hunt submarines. It operated long-range patrol bombers, mostly obsolete aircraft like the Avro Anson and Armstrong Whitworth Whitley. These machines were slow, underarmed, and poorly suited for maritime warfare. Their crews were brave, but they were fighting with tools designed for a different war. The tactics were equally outdated. When a patrol aircraft spotted a U-boat on the surface, usually while the submarine was recharging its batteries or transiting at speed, the pilot was instructed to approach from altitude. The standard procedure was to fly at 2,000 feet or higher, line up the target, and release depth charges from a safe distance. The logic was simple: altitude gave the pilot time to aim, time to adjust, and, most importantly, time to escape if the U-boat fought back. But the logic was flawed. Depth charges dropped from 2,000 feet took precious seconds to fall. During that time, the U-boat commander had two options: crash dive or maneuver. Most chose to dive. The submarine's diesels would cut, the vents would open, and the hull would slip beneath the surface in less than 30 seconds. By the time the depth charges hit the water, the U-boat was already deep, already gone. The explosions would churn the sea into white foam, but the submarine would escape. Rattled, perhaps, but intact. Even when the U-boat stayed on the surface to fight, the altitude gave its deck gunners a clear target. The 20mm flak cannon mounted on the conning tower could track a slow-moving bomber easily at range. Several Coastal Command aircraft were shot down attempting textbook attacks. Altitude, it turned out, was not always safety. The results were grim. Throughout 1940 and early 1941, Coastal Command's kill rate was appalling. Hundreds of patrols, dozens of sightings, handfuls of kills. For every U-boat sunk by aircraft, dozens slipped away. The depth charges were too slow, the fuses too unreliable, the tactics too predictable. Submariners began to mock the British bombers. Some U-boat crews didn't even bother diving anymore, they simply turned and fired back. The Admiralty grew frustrated. Churchill grew impatient. Coastal Command needed results. But changing doctrine in wartime is like turning a battleship. It takes time, evidence, and, above all, someone willing to break the rules. Someone young enough not to care about consequences. Someone reckless enough to fly an aircraft 50 feet above the ocean at full throttle, directly into the guns of a surface submarine, and drop bombs close enough to feel the blast. That someone was about to arrive. His name has been lost to much of official history, buried in classified reports and faded logbooks. But those who flew with him remembered. He was 18 when he joined Coastal Command in early 1941, barely old enough to vote. Too young, some said, to understand fear. He had trained on Tiger Moths and Harvards at an airfield in Scotland, learning to fly in conditions that would ground most civilian pilots. Rain, fog, crosswinds that could flip a trainer on landing. He was a natural. His instructors noted his reflexes, his calm under pressure, his tendency to push limits. They also noted his disregard for rules he deemed unnecessary. He wanted to fly bombers. Coastal Command needed pilots desperately, and they weren't particular about age or temperament. What mattered was whether you could keep a twin-engine bomber in the air for 8 hours over open ocean, navigate by dead reckoning when the clouds rolled in, and find your way home with fuel gauges reading empty. He could. His first posting was to a squadron operating Lockheed Hudsons out of a base in Northern Ireland. The Hudson was an American-built light bomber, adapted for maritime reconnaissance. It was faster than the Anson, better armed than the Whitley, and, crucially, it had the range to patrol deep into the Atlantic Gap, that stretch of ocean beyond the reach of land-based aircraft where U-boats operated with impunity. The squadron's mission was simple: find U-boats, attack them, sink them. The execution was anything but simple. The young pilot flew his first patrol in March 1941. 8 hours over gray water. No sightings. No action. Just the endless drone of engines and the slow sweep of binoculars across an empty horizon. His second patrol was the same. And his third. On his fourth patrol, he saw his first U-boat. It was late afternoon. The light was failing. The submarine was running on the surface, recharging batteries, making good speed toward its patrol zone. The pilot's navigator called it out, black silhouette against silver water, 3 miles ahead. The crew went to action stations. The pilot climbed to 2,000 feet, just as the manual prescribed. He lined up the approach. The U-boat spotted them. Diesel smoke poured from its exhausts as it accelerated. Then the conning tower hatch slammed shut. The submarine began to dive. The pilot released the depth charges at 2,000 feet, exactly by the book. They fell, tumbling end over end. By the time they hit the water, the U-boat was gone. The charges exploded in perfect circles of white foam. The crew circled, searching for oil, debris, any sign of a kill. There was nothing. The submarine had escaped. The pilot said nothing on the flight back, but his mind was working. He had seen the time lag. He had counted the seconds between release and impact. He had watched the U-boat slip beneath the surface with time to spare. The tactic didn't work. It couldn't work. Not unless the pilot closed the gap between aircraft and target, cutting the U-boat's reaction time to zero. That meant flying low, dangerously low. The idea came to him not as inspiration, but as mathematics. If a depth charge fell from 2,000 feet, it took roughly 6 seconds to hit the water. A U-boat could crash dive in 30 seconds, but the first 15 were the most critical: vents opening, ballast tanks flooding, the hull beginning its descent. If the pilot could cut those 6 seconds of fall time to 2, or even 1, the submarine would still be on the surface when the charges detonated. The explosion would crush the hull before it could dive. But flying at 50 feet meant flying into hell. The margin for error disappeared entirely. A gust of wind could slam the aircraft into the waves. A moment of distraction, a slight miscalculation on the yoke, and the bomber would cartwheel across the surface in a shower of fuel and aluminum. The pilot would have no time to pull up if the U-boat's gunners opened fire. He would be flying straight into their sights, close enough to see the muzzle flashes, close enough to feel the rounds punching through the fuselage. It was suicide. Or it was genius. The young pilot began experimenting on his own, away from the eyes of squadron commanders. On patrols where no U-boats were sighted, he would drop altitude over empty ocean, pushing the Hudson lower and lower, feeling how the aircraft responded at 50 feet, at 30, at 20. The turbulence was brutal. The air near the surface was unstable, thick with salt spray and shifting wind. The engines screamed. The airframe shook. His crew said nothing, but he could feel their fear. He learned to read the water. At that altitude, every wave mattered. He learned to anticipate swells, to ride the invisible cushion of air that formed between the aircraft and the sea. He learned the exact angle of approach, the precise moment to release, the split-second timing required to pull up before the blast wave hit. He practiced until it became instinct, until his hands moved without thought, until the aircraft became an extension of his body. Then he waited for another U-boat. From the submarine's perspective, the threat came from above. U-boat commanders were trained to watch the sky at high altitude. Lookouts scanned the horizon with binoculars, searching for the silhouette of an aircraft at 2,000 feet or higher. That was where the danger lived. That was where bombers attacked. No one looked down. At 50 feet, an aircraft was almost invisible against the gray water. By the time the lookout spotted the shape, low, fast, closing impossibly quickly, it was already too late. There was no time to sound the alarm, no time to man the deck gun, no time to dive. The U-boat was caught on the surface, exposed, defenseless. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Submariners were accustomed to feeling safe on the surface, at least during daylight hours. They could see aircraft coming from miles away. They had options. They had time. But the low-altitude attacks shattered that sense of security. Suddenly, death could come from anywhere, at any moment, without warning. The ocean's surface was no longer a refuge. It was a killing ground. U-boat crews began reporting encounters with mad, British pilots who flew directly at them, so low the aircraft's propellers nearly touched the water. Some commanders refused to believe the reports. Others demanded answers from headquarters. How were the British pilots surviving these attacks? How were they pulling up in time? Why weren't the depth charges destroying the aircraft along with the submarine? The answer lay in the fuses. Standard depth charges used hydrostatic fuses, designed to detonate at a preset depth underwater, usually 25 or 50 feet. The idea was to explode beneath the submarine, where the pressure wave would crush the hull. But when dropped from extreme low altitude, the charges hit the water at near horizontal trajectories, skipping once or twice before sinking. The fuses were adjusted to detonate on impact or within seconds of submersion, creating a surface explosion that ripped through the U-boat's thin outer hull before it could dive. The young pilot had figured this out through trial and observation. He worked with the squadron's ordnance crew, modifying fuse settings, testing different release altitudes, calculating blast radii. It was dangerous work. One miscalculation and the aircraft would be caught in its own explosion. But he was methodical. He documented everything. He refined the technique with each mission. His squadron commander didn't see it as innovation. He saw it as insubordination. After the pilot's fifth patrol, during which he broke altitude protocol again, though still without encountering a U-boat, he was called into the commander's office. The conversation was brief and unambiguous. The rules existed for a reason. Coastal Command had lost too many aircraft to reckless flying. Pilots who ignored doctrine put their crews at risk, endangered missions, and undermined discipline. The young pilot was grounded, not permanently, not officially, but he was removed from active patrol duty and reassigned to training flights and coastal reconnaissance, missions with no chance of combat. It was a punishment disguised as a precaution. The message was clear: follow orders, or don't fly. He followed orders, for 3 weeks. But the U-boats didn't stop. The convoys kept dying. And the young pilot kept thinking about those 6 seconds, about the submarine slipping away, about the gap between doctrine and reality. He knew his method worked. He just needed the chance to prove it. That chance came in June 1941, on a morning when fog blanketed the North Atlantic and the patrol roster was short 2 crews. One aircraft had mechanical trouble. Another crew was down with illness. The squadron commander needed bodies in cockpits. The young pilot volunteered. His commander hesitated, then relented. 1 patrol. Standard altitude. No deviations. The pilot nodded. He took off at 0600 hours. The Hudson climbed through thick cloud, breaking into clear sky at 3,000 feet. The navigator set a course southwest, toward the convoy routes where U-boats had been reported the previous day. The radio operator monitored frequencies. The gunner checked his weapons. The pilot flew straight and level, exactly as instructed. For 2 hours, they saw nothing. Then the navigator spotted it, a dark shape on the surface, 8 miles ahead. The pilot dropped altitude to confirm. It was a U-boat, type VAC, running on the surface at full speed. The submarine hadn't seen them yet. The pilot had a choice. He could follow doctrine, climb to 2,000 feet, make a textbook approach, drop the charges and watch the U-boat dive away, just like the last time. He could return to base, file a report, and continue flying training missions until the war ended or he was reassigned. Or he could do what he knew would work. He pushed the yoke forward. The Hudson's nose dropped. The altimeter unwound rapidly. 2,000 feet. 1,500. The crew realized what was happening. The navigator shouted something over the intercom. The pilot didn't respond. His eyes were locked on the water, on the U-boat growing larger in his windscreen. 200 feet. 150. The waves were close enough to touch. The aircraft skimmed the surface, propellers churning spray. The U-boat's lookout finally saw them, too late. The alarm sounded. Men scrambled on deck. The deck gun began to traverse, but there was no time to aim, no time to fire. The pilot released the charges at 40 feet. For Mark 8 depth charges tumbled from the bomb bay, each weighing 250 pounds. They hit the water in a tight line, one after another, directly across the U-boat's path. The fuses triggered on impact. The explosions came almost simultaneously, for massive geysers of white water erupting around the submarine. The pilot pulled up hard, engines roaring at full power. The aircraft climbed away, shaking from the blast wave. Behind him, the sea was a boiling cauldron of foam and debris. The crew circled back. The U-boat was still visible, but it was no longer moving. The conning tower was listing to port. Oil spread across the water in a dark slick. Men were in the water, struggling to stay afloat. The submarine's stern was rising, the bow sinking. Within 2 minutes, the U-boat slipped beneath the surface. Only the oil remained, spreading wider, marking the grave. The pilot's first kill. He said nothing on the flight back. His crew said nothing either. They knew what he had done. They knew what it meant. When they landed, the ground crew counted the survivors, all of them. The aircraft had taken no damage. Not a single round had hit them. The squadron commander was waiting on the tarmac. The pilot expected to be court-martialed. Instead, the commander asked for a full debrief. The pilot described the attack in detail: altitude, speed, release point, fuse settings, blast radius. He showed his calculations. He explained the mathematics. The commander listened without interruption. Then he asked one question: "Can you teach this to the other pilots?" The young pilot could. And he did. Over the following weeks, he trained a small group of volunteers in the low-altitude attack technique. They practiced over empty ocean, refining their approaches, learning to read the water, building the muscle memory required to fly that low without killing themselves. Not everyone succeeded. 2 aircraft were lost during training. One clipped a wave and cartwheeled into the sea, killing the entire crew. The other pulled up too late and stalled, crashing tail first into the Atlantic. But those who mastered the technique became hunters. By August 1941, the young pilot had flown 12 more combat patrols. He encountered U-boats on 7 of them. He sank 4. The other 3 managed to dive in time, but even those near misses rattled the German submariners. They began reporting the attacks to headquarters. U-boat command issued new standing orders: when aircraft are sighted, dive immediately. Do not wait. Do not assess altitude. Do not engage with deck guns. Just dive. But even that wasn't always enough. The pilot's 6th kill came in September, off the coast of Iceland. The U-boat had already begun its crash dive when the Hudson appeared. The conning tower was half submerged. Only the periscope and the tip of the conning tower remained visible. The pilot released his charges anyway, aiming for the swirl of disturbed water where the submarine had gone under. The depth charges detonated 15 feet below the surface. The pressure wave crushed the U-boat's hull like an eggshell. A massive air bubble erupted from the depths, followed by debris, pieces of wooden decking, shattered instruments, a life jacket. No survivors. The submarine had imploded, its crew killed instantly by the shockwave. The other pilots began calling him the Reaper. It wasn't a nickname born of affection. It was recognition of something darker. His willingness to fly into situations that would kill most men, his cold calculation of risk, his refusal to acknowledge fear. He didn't celebrate his kills. He didn't keep count on the side of his aircraft. He simply flew, hunted, killed, and returned. By November 1941, he had sunk 8 U-boats. Coastal Command began quietly adopting his tactics. Other squadrons received new training protocols. Altitude restrictions were revised. Fuse settings were adjusted. The official doctrine didn't change overnight. Bureaucracies moved slowly, even in wartime, but the operational reality shifted. Pilots who had flown by the book for years suddenly found themselves practicing low-altitude runs. Squadron commanders who had grounded reckless aviators now encouraged calculated aggression. The statistics began to reflect the change. In the first 6 months of 1941, Coastal Command sank 7 U-boats. In the second half of the year, that number climbed to 19. Not all were due to low-altitude attacks, improved radar, better coordination with naval forces, and the introduction of long-range aircraft all played roles. But the tactical shift was undeniable. U-boats could no longer surface with impunity. The ocean's surface had become lethal. German submariners noticed. U-boat losses climbed throughout late 1941 and into 1942. Morale among submarine crews began to erode. The men who returned from patrol spoke of aircraft that appeared from nowhere, of attacks so sudden there was no time to react, of comrades lost without warning. Admiral Karl Donitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, demanded answers. His captains had no good ones to give. The young pilot's 12th kill came in January 1942. It was his last. The patrol began like any other. Clear skies. Moderate seas. A convoy route southeast of Greenland. The Hudson had been airborne for 3 hours when the navigator spotted a U-boat on the surface, making good speed toward the convoy's projected path. The pilot descended immediately, dropping to 50 feet without hesitation. The approach was perfect. The U-boat's lookout spotted them late but not too late. The deck gun opened fire. Tracers arced toward the Hudson, bright against the gray sky. One round punched through the port wing, another through the fuselage behind the cockpit. The pilot didn't flinch. He held his course. He released at 30 feet. The depth charges hit the water in a perfect line, straddling the U-boat's hull. The explosions lifted the submarine halfway out of the water, breaking its back. The conning tower twisted violently. The hull split open. The submarine sank in less than 20 seconds. But the Hudson was in trouble. The rounds that had hit the fuselage had severed a fuel line. Gasoline was streaming from the port wing, vaporizing in the slipstream. The port engine began to sputter. The pilot feathered the propeller, shutting down the engine before it caught fire. The Hudson limped forward on one engine, losing altitude slowly. The nearest airfield was 180 miles northeast. The pilot did the math. They might make it. Barely. If the remaining engine held. If the fuel lasted. If the weather didn't turn. The crew dumped everything they could to reduce weight, ammunition, tools, survival gear, even the life raft. They flew at wave-top height, conserving every drop of fuel. They made it. The Hudson touched down with less than 10 minutes of fuel remaining. The landing gear collapsed on rollout, damaged by the earlier gunfire, and the aircraft slid to a stop in a shower of sparks and torn metal. But the crew walked away. All of them. The pilot never flew combat again. Not because he was afraid. Not because he refused. But because the aircraft couldn't be repaired in time, and by the time a replacement arrived, he had been reassigned. Coastal Command had recognized the value of his tactical knowledge. They needed him as an instructor more than they needed him as a combat pilot. He spent the next 2 years training others. Hundreds of pilots passed through his courses, learning the techniques he had pioneered. Some became aces in their own right. Others died attempting maneuvers they weren't ready for. The pilot taught them all the same way. With precision, with patience, and with a cold understanding that war didn't care about courage. It cared about results. By the time the war ended, Coastal Command had sunk over 200 U-boats. Not all were attributed to low-altitude attacks, but the tactic had become standard procedure. What had once been considered reckless was now doctrine. What had once been punished was now taught. The young pilot received no medals, no public recognition. His name appeared in classified reports and training manuals, but nowhere else. He didn't mind. He had never flown for glory. He had flown because the convoys needed protection, because the U-boats needed to be stopped, because someone had to close that 6-second gap between release and impact. He survived the war. Many of the pilots he trained did not. The U-boats he sank took hundreds of German sailors to the bottom of the Atlantic. Young men, many of them no older than he was, who had joined the Kriegsmarine believing in victory, in duty, in survival. They drowned in darkness, crushed by pressure or trapped in flooded compartments, their final moments unrecorded except in the logbooks of British pilots and the casualty lists compiled in Berlin. War compressed everything. It took 18-year-olds and made them killers. It took bombers designed for reconnaissance and turned them into submarine hunters. It took tactics that should have been suicidal and proved them effective. It measured success in tonnage sunk, in lives lost, in convoys saved. The pilot understood this. He had always understood it. That was why he had broken the rules in the first place, not out of rebellion, but out of necessity. The old tactics weren't working. Men were dying. Convoys were being destroyed. Someone had to try something different, even if it meant flying into the face of death at 50 feet above the ocean. He tried. It worked. Others followed. That was the entirety of his war. The Atlantic remembers none of it. The ocean doesn't keep records. The waves that rolled beneath his aircraft in 1941 rolled the same way in 1945, and they roll the same way now. The wrecks of the U-boats he sank rest on the seafloor, entombed in darkness, visited only by deep-sea creatures that don't understand what they are. But the men who flew with him remembered. They remembered the sound of the engine screaming at full throttle, the feel of the aircraft shaking as it skimmed the waves, the sight of depth charges tumbling through spray-filled air. They remembered the explosions, the oil slicks, the debris. They remembered their own fear, and they remembered the young pilot who never seemed to feel it. Some of them wrote about it, years later, in memoirs and interviews. They called him fearless, though he wasn't. They called him lucky, though luck had nothing to do with it. They called him the best pilot they ever flew with, and on that point, they were probably right. The pilot himself said very little. After the war, he returned to civilian life. He flew commercial routes for a few years, then left aviation entirely. He never spoke publicly about his wartime service. When asked, he would say only that he had done his job, nothing more. He died in 1983, in a small town far from the sea. The obituary mentioned his wartime service in passing, without detail. There was no mention of the 12 U-boats, no mention of the tactic he pioneered, no mention of the hundreds of pilots he trained. Just a single line. He served with distinction in the Royal Air Force during World War II. That was enough for him. But history remembers differently. Not in monuments or medals, but in the fact that the Battle of the Atlantic was won. The convoys got through. Britain didn't starve. The war continued. And part of that victory, small, uncelebrated, but real, belonged to an 18-year-old pilot who refused to accept that 6 seconds was an insurmountable gap. He proved it wasn't. And in doing so, he changed the war.